So that was an important first set of options. Now let's dive into these strict options, because these are pretty interesting. There is this strict true option, and actually what this does is it enables all strict type checking options. So effectively setting this is the same as if you would set all these options separately. So you can either set all these options one by one, or just set this option. Of course, you want to set the individual options if you want to have some options set to false, because otherwise they're all set to true. If you want them all set to true, then using just this option is of course way shorter. Now what do these options do though? Let's start with no implicit any. No implicit any is a quite interesting option that helps us write better code. Let's go to our analytics file here, and there let's add a function send analytics that gets a data option, let's say. And there we could send this to a server, but here I'm just console logging it. Then I call send analytics with the data, so with the string. Now as you see, my IDE already complains here, and so does TypeScript, the compiler, because the two of course are connected if I try to compile this. Parameter data implicitly has an any type. So this seems to be related to this no implicit any option. Indeed, if I set this to false, so if I set all strict options to true, but I set this option to false, which I can do, then this error goes away, both in the IDE and when we compile the code. So what does this option do? It ensures, and I'll comment it out again to turn it on again because of strict true, it ensures that we have to be clear about our parameters, about the values we're working with in our code. Here, we don't give TypeScript any information about the type of data we'll get as a parameter here, and we should. If TypeScript is able to infer this, then of course it's fine, but here, how would TypeScript be able to infer it? From this line? Well, keep in mind that this function gets declared first before this file executes, so at the point of time when the function is created, there is no chance of knowing what will end up in there. So here, we can fix this error by simply declaring the type and being clear about which type we use there. Now please note that if you had a variable logged and you set this to true here, you don't get an error about this declaration, even though it also gets a default type of any. For variables, this is okay. For parameters, it's not okay. Why is it okay for variables? Because what TypeScript does for variables, what is possible for variables, what's not possible here because the function is created first. Here, TypeScript is able to track the values you assign. You see, okay, I got logged here like this. Now I set it to true. So therefore, thereafter, if I console log logged here, it's a Boolean. So TypeScript is here able to understand the flow of your code, and therefore you don't need to be precise regarding the type here. Of course, you want to be precise if you want to avoid that you can freely assign a new value, which you can do here because it is of type any. So you want to still assign a type to avoid this. But TypeScript is at least able to find out if the code you're calling works with the type it currently holds. That's not the case here because there the function is defined before you call it, and therefore TypeScript would have no chance of knowing if what you pass in there can be used inside of the function. Strict null checks is another important option. It's actually related to our button selection, which we have here. Remember, I had to add this exclamation mark here to make it work, otherwise I'd get an error. Now we can also get rid of that error without adding the exclamation mark by setting strict null checks to false. So let's do that here and let's save this. And as you see, this error is now gone here and I can compile all files. Now what do strict null checks do? They tell TypeScript to be pretty, well, strict regarding how you access and work with values that might potentially hold a null value. And button here might be null. It's not always pointing at a button element. It's not always pointing at such an element because even though you have such a selector here, a button might simply not exist on the page on which this script runs. And therefore, TypeScript can't tell because it's not diving into your HTML file and looking at that. It can't tell whether this will be successful or not. And if this fails to return a pointer at a DOM node, then it will return null or undefined to be precise, but that's treated equally here. So therefore then button might hold a null value, and therefore this code could fail. Indeed, if I comment out this button here, if I now compile everything, it works because I disabled the null checks. But I therefore now have a runtime error because I can't call event listener, add event listener on null. And I got null here because I got no button. Now this is a mistake we could avoid by setting strict null checks to true. And that's automatically set if we have strict set to true, where TypeScript anticipates that this might happen and therefore forces us to work around that. Now one cheap workaround is this exclamation mark operator here. This tells TypeScript that you, the developer, know that this button exists or that this operation will yield a non-null value. Now maybe you do. You certainly do if you know that you are working on the HTML code and that there is a button here, that this selector here will work. So it would be fine to use the exclamation mark in this scenario. If you have another scenario where you don't know for sure if it works and you just hope that it works, then it might be better to simply wrap the code that might fail in an if check, which will be there at runtime as well, of course. You could simply check if button is truthy, which it won't be if it's null or undefined, and move that code into this if check here. Now, even without the exclamation mark, in strict null checks mode, we get no error because TypeScript understands that this code is inside of this if statement and that this if statement makes sure that button is not null and that this will not fail. So this might actually be the cleaner workaround. However, of course, to save code, if you know with certainty that something does exist, using the exclamation mark is shorter and an absolutely fine option. Here I set both so that we see both. Of course, you just need one of the two things, either the if check or the exclamation mark. Strict function types here is a little bit of a more advanced setting, catching some niche bugs which you might not have in many applications. It is related to, well, function types you might be setting up. So not types inside of functions, but if you define how a function should look like regarding its parameters and return value, and you create such a function type, which you learned about in the basics module, then there you can introduce bugs if you work with classes and inheritance, which we haven't learned about yet, which we haven't used yet, and therefore for now let's ignore this. Strict bind, call, apply. That can be helpful if you do work with bind, call, or apply. For that, let's quickly see an example. Here we have our button and our function there. Now let's say this would be a function which we define here with the function keyword or as an error function, doesn't matter. I'll use the function keyword here. Click handler, and in there I console log clicked. And now here we point at click handler, and for some reason we want to make sure that when this executes, we pass in certain arguments or we set the this keyword in there to a certain value. Now let's say here we do expect a message argument, which should be a string, and we want to output this here as well. Now, since click handler is passed to add event listener like that, so that the browser basically executes this for us, if we want to pre-configure the arguments which will be passed in, we can use bind. And bind as our first argument takes what we want to bind the this keyword to. And here we could say that does not matter to us because we're not using this in this function, so we bind it to null. Now you see here I get an error. I get an error that can be avoided if I set strict bind, call, and apply to false. Now you see the error is gone. Now what does this option do therefore? It basically checks on which function you're calling bind, call, or apply, and it checks if what you're setting up here makes sense. And here TypeScript sees we want an argument, we want a parameter in click handler. With bind, we're not configuring that though, and therefore here we get an error. If I set this back to true, or I just commented it out, because of course it is set to true by default by setting strict to true, we therefore get the error again. Now if we wouldn't expect an argument here, you see the error would be gone down there if we also remove the message, because TypeScript understands our code and sees you're not passing in any arguments to that method or to this function because it doesn't take any. So that's fine. But of course here we want one, so we get an error. The solution is to provide this second argument here, which is the first argument we want to pass in. Now, TypeScript is really smart here, and for example, if I pass in a number, it would still complain because it understands that I need a string here. If I pass in a correct string though, like you're welcome, then it does not complain anymore because now it understands this and it sees that this is matching my function definition here. So this is a very useful behavior that makes sure that you don't accidentally use bind, call, or apply in a way that does not work with your code. Now, strict property initialization becomes important once we work with classes. We can ignore it for now. No implicit this also does not matter right now. It has to do with the this keyword, and TypeScript basically tries to warn you if you use the this keyword in a place where it's not clear what it refers to. And always strict simply controls that the JavaScript files which are generated are using strict mode, so that this is added. With that, we covered all these strict options.